Hey everybody, Arnaldo here broadcasting from Fidelio's Frequency. Welcome to my channel. As you probably noticed from the title of the video, today we'll be talking about the Beatles. And I typically haven't done any ranking videos apart from your year-end list and maybe an occasional tag here and there, but I haven't really tackled the task of ranking any particular artist's albums, songs, or what it may be. So I figured let's start off with my favorite band, the Beatles. And what prompted it was, or at least gave me the inspiration for the topic of the video, was the fact that I purchased something that was on my want list for about 40 years. A few months ago, I was record shopping out of town, and I came across something that was in fantastic condition at a very reasonable price, or fair price, let's say this. And I couldn't help but pull the trigger and get the Beatles Singles Collection. Now, this is the companion set to the BC13, which is the equivalent blue box of the albums, collecting the Beatles output. And there's also another EP collection similar to this singles box set. But back in the 80s, I saw this when I was a teenager. Couldn't afford it back then. Glad I can now. It's in fantastic condition. It's as if it's new with all its parts. And even though I already owned the 2019 version of the singles collection, this, for me, really tops it in the sense that they're different. They're very different in terms of all of the picture sleeves, and maybe the sound is slightly different, but this has a more of a nostalgic component to the purchase. So glad I got this. And what's in here, you're probably asking. I won't go through a complete unboxing. There's videos out there that focus and do a much better job on showing it, and compare also to the 2019 box set. But I will tell you that it includes the 22 official UK singles that the Beatles released during their time, during their activity, at least through 1970, and adds 4 exclusive to this box set singles. And that's what I based my criteria on, also because I listened to them all and I came to appreciate the actual craft that the Beatles had in releasing singles. So I figured maybe I'll tackle ranking the Beatles' best singles. Now, like I said, I included in this selection those 22 singles. I did not include what was released posthumously, which is, of course, Free as a Bird from 96. Real Life, also, I believe, was this 96 or maybe 97? Actually, I believe this was 95. Yeah. Free as a Bird was 95. This was 96, or what just came out a few months ago, Now and Then, the final song by the Beatles. Not including those, although they're really nice with picture sleeves, but we are including in the selection, and this is the booklet from the 2019 version, the 22 singles here reproduced in their original sleeves, which were all standard Parlophone or Apple sleeves, with the exception of 2 that were picture. So now the criteria in my ranking. I didn't choose songs per se. I chose singles, meaning A-side and B-side, that I thought were some of their best. So the singles in terms of a 7-inch format, including A-side and B-side, because they put out some fantastic other songs that maybe, in my opinion, weren't coupled on the B-side with a good enough B-side compared to others. So I figured let's start off with that criteria. And I did cheat a little bit because I couldn't limit myself to 10. So I had to include an 11th one, a bonus one, because both A-side and B-side are too good to be excluded. And I know I'm not going to attract a lot of comments, but you didn't include this single and that single. It's really hard. We're talking about the Beatles here, so narrowing it down to 10 was already a difficult task for me. So I had to include as an 11th selection, Lady Madonna, backed with The Inner Light. And reason being, mostly because of The Inner Light. But let's talk briefly about Lady Madonna. Single that was released in March of 1968. And it shows a departure, actually a return to a standard form of songwriting. 1967, the Beatles were all about Summer of Love, psychedelia. Lady Madonna is more of a rock and roll, boogie woogie, almost kind of with an Elvis delivery song, and more standard format songwriting, let's call it that. The B-side, as I said, is The Inner Light, song by George Harrison. It marks the first appearance of a George Harrison song on a single, albeit a B-side. Now, originally, John had hoped that Across the Universe was going to be the next single or possibly the B-side to Lady Madonna, but he was not yet satisfied with the progress of Across the Universe so far, so decided to put it aside so that they could work on it further, and suggested instead they use The Inner Light. Interesting thing about The Inner Light is the lyrics are a translation from a Sanskrit text. George was all about transcendental meditation, just like for Love You Too and Within You Without You. This follows the same type of influence, Eastern music, or be it Indian music. It was recorded actually in India. George was recording his first solo album, which was a soundtrack to Wonderwall, and his first album, Wonderwall Music. And he recorded with Indian musicians, all local musicians, the backing tracks of The Inner Light, and applied the vocal back in the UK, I believe at Abbey Road. And the only other two Beatles, no other Beatles play on the song except for John and Paul, who offer some backing vocals towards the end. So that's my cheat, my 11th song, my 11th single, actually, Lady Madonna, backed with The Inner Light. And now we get into the proper top 10. Coming in at number 10 on my list of the Beatles' 10 best singles is The Ballad of John and Yoko, backed by Old Brown Shoe. This is the 20th single by the Beatles, released in May of 1969. And this went to number 8 on the US charts and number 1 on the UK charts. It would be the last single by the Beatles to end up on the number 1 spot in the UK for 54 years until last year, 2023, Now and Then came out, and which topped the charts again for the last time, I guess, up until now for the Beatles. But let's go back to Ballad of John and Yoko, side A. The song was written by John Lennon to chronicle the adventure of getting married to Yoko Ono. John and Yoko went to Paul, and John was so enthusiastic about the song, he asked Paul to go in and record it together immediately. And that's why John and Paul are the only Beatles on the Ballad of John and Yoko. They play all the instruments, sing all the vocals. And probably because of that, Ringo and George believe whether they're traveling or on vacation. And because of that, John kind of felt bad and chose Old Brown Shoe by George Harrison. This is the second song by George Harrison. We saw the first one was The Inner Light, to appear as a B-side or appear on a Beatles single. And the track was started during the Get Back sessions, and they finished it off and included it as a B-side to The Ballad of John and Yoko, number 10 on my list. Coming in at number 9, we have a double A-side. Double A-side meant that both of the tracks had a focus for radio, and they were both marketed individually. As a matter of fact, charts were compiled not only based on physical sales, also on radio play. Hence why the choice of making them a double A-side. And coming in at number 9 is Yellow Submarine, backed by Eleanor Rigby. This is the 13th single released by the Beatles. It came out in August, I believe, of 1966. It went to number 1 on the UK charts, number 2 on the US charts. Yellow Submarine was written by Paul and John for Ringo, and this marks the first appearance of a Ringo vocal on a Beatles single. So a first here also for Ringo. And the B-side, a little bit of contentious authorship. Both Paul and John on separate occasions have claimed the authorship, or at least the majority of the authorship, of Eleanor Rigby. Number 9, Yellow Submarine, backed by Eleanor Rigby. Coming in at number 8 on my list of the Beatles' best singles is I Feel Fine, backed by She's a Woman. This is the 8th single released in the UK by the Beatles, released in November of 1964. Side A, first of all, it went to number 1 in both the US and the UK. Side A features I Feel Fine, maybe the first appearance of feedback, of guitar feedback on a single or maybe on a song. Mostly a John composition. And the B-side, and this is why I chose it, such a great track, often forgotten, is She's a Woman, mostly a Paul song. Some people have called it more of a rock blues song. I hear the reggae in She's a Woman, and as a matter of fact, 2 covers that came out of excellent covers of She's a Woman subsequently do highlight more of a reggae arrangement, and that is the cover by Jeff Beck and the cover by Scritti Politti that came out late 80s, I believe, or maybe early 90s. So coming in at number 8 is the 8th single by the Beatles, I Feel Fine, backed by She's a Woman. Coming in at number 7 on my list of best Beatles singles is a track that everybody knows, All You Need Is Love, backed by Baby You're a Rich Man, the 15th single released in the UK by the Beatles, went to number 1 in the US, UK, and probably countless countries because it was premiered and it was broadcast live to about 400 million people. A live broadcast, a worldwide satellite live broadcast. Even though the track wasn't entirely played live, they did have some backing tracks that were recorded a couple days earlier because the Beatles felt that they probably couldn't give the track the fullest if it was all performed live. So yes, there's like orchestral arrangements and so forth, but there were a bunch of guests also present in the studio when they were performing it. Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Keith Moon, Eric Clapton, I think maybe was there, Graham Nash. It was a big, fun fest, Summer of Love fest. And the B-side, Baby You're a Rich Man, yes, All You Need Is Love, mostly, almost entirely a John track. Baby You're a Rich Man was a collaboration between the chorus written by Paul and the verses and most of the rest of the song by John Lennon, also featured on Magical Mystery Tour. So coming in at number 7, All You Need Is Love, backed by Baby You're a Rich Man. Coming in at number 6 is the 16th single released in the UK by the Beatles in November of 1967, and that would be Hello Goodbye, backed by I Am the Walrus. 2 very different songs. The first one, a Paul song, I Am the Walrus, a John song. The first one, very poppy, I Am the Walrus, very still psychedelic and very out there. John campaigned very hard to have I Am the Walrus as the A-side, but relented once along with the other three, realized probably that Hello Goodbye was the catchier tune, the poppier ones, and probably best suited for an A-side. The single went to #1 in the US and the UK, was inspired by LSD, was inspired by Lewis Carroll's Walrus and the Carpenter. It also, Why I'm the Walrus, I believe, got banned by the BBC because of the lyric, "Girl, you let your knickers down." So, nonetheless, fantastic #6 on my list of the top Beatles singles, Hello Goodbye, I Am the Walrus. Coming in at #5 is a 12th single released in the UK by the Beatles in May of 1966, and that would be Paperback Writer, backed by Rain. The single went to #1 in the US and the UK. Side A, Paperback Writer, written mostly by Paul. Side B, Rain, written by John. Paperback Writer, in writing that, Paul set out to write a song only revolving around one note. He almost achieved it because apart from a brief pause and a shift to a C in the bridge, it's mostly written around the note G. Interesting that this song has so much bass that actually it is up until then, this is the loudest single that was cut up until then. And they were able to achieve that, the engineers, because they had a new technology at Abbey Road, or EMI. So this is one of the loudest cut singles up until then by the Beatles. Side B, Rain, is probably in my opinion, one of the best B-sides by the Beatles. For sure, it has the best drumming, and Ringo even says that on a Beatles track, drumming by Ringo, of course. And it features, for the first time, the backwards loops. Some of John's lyrics were reversed and played backwards, and this was happening all around the sessions of Revolver, so this is the first appearance of them being released like that. So #5 is Paperback Writer, backed by Rain. At #4, I chose the 11th single released by the Beatles in November of 1965 from the Rubber Soul sessions. We have We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper. I don't want to say backed because this is a double A-side. It went to #1 in the US and the UK. A true collaboration by John and Paul for We Can Work It Out, and mostly a John song. Day Tripper, kind of alluding also to, there was a little bit of a double entendre here, alluding also to the trip, the drug use that they were doing at the time, especially LSD maybe. So what else can I say? Fantastic song. We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper coming in at #4. And now the top 3 singles of my list. Coming in at #3, Hey Jude, backed by Revolution. 18th single by the Beatles, released in November of 1968, before the White Album was released. Went to #1. The single went to #1 in the US and the UK. The longest single by the Beatles, Hey Jude, clocking in at over 7 minutes. The first single on their new Apple imprint, the new labels, no longer Parlophone. Everybody knows Hey Jude, written by Paul for John's son Julian, originally Hey Jules, then Hey Jude. But let's talk a little bit about Revolution. Revolution featured also on the White Album. Apart from Revolution #9, there's a Revolution 1 featured on the White Album, which is totally different than the Revolution on the B-side here. This is a louder, more in-your-face, faster. I prefer Revolution as the B-side to the version on the White Album. Interesting thing that made it so loud was that Lennon suggested something that is a no-no, absolutely. I think Jeff Emmerich said, I would have gotten fired if everyone knew about it. They plugged in the guitars directly into the mixing desk. That's why the guitars are so loud and so distorted. So John Lennon also wanted Revolution to be the A-side. Very political song, probably the first political song since Taxman, and he campaigned very hard, and everyone else said, hey, we can't put this as an A-side, it'll attract way too much attention, and they chose Hey Jude instead. So coming in at number 3, Hey Jude and Revolution. Number 2 on my list of best Beatles singles is Something and Come Together. I say and because we have another double A-side, Something, Come Together, or Come Together Something. Released, 19th single released by the Beatles in October of 1969. Went to number 1 in the US, only number 4 in the UK. First and only time that a George Harrison song was featured as an A-side. And what a fantastic song. Written for Pattie Boyd, his wife. John Lennon and Paul McCartney both said that Something was the best song on Abbey Road. And this is the first time also that the Beatles broke their rule of not releasing singles with songs from the album that was already out. So this is the one and only time that happened. And Come Together, written by John Lennon. Ringo has stated that Come Together is his favorite Beatles song all time. Interesting use of tea towels. Little piece of trivia on top of the drums, on top of the toms, to give that muffled sound that we hear that is so characteristic of Come Together. John Lennon wrote this initially having in mind to write a campaign song for Timothy Leary, which their slogan was Come Together and Join the Party, but I think this never ended up being that campaign song. But in any case, number 2 on my list of the best singles by the Beatles, Something, Come Together, or Come Together Something. And here we are at number 1, the best single released by the Beatles, Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, or Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields Forever, because we have another double A-side single released in February of 67. It was the 14th single released by the Beatles, went to number 1 in the US, only number 2, according to Record Retailer, who I believe was the official chart compiler at the time. Held off from the top spot by Engelbert Humperdinck's Release Me. I don't know who remembers that song. In any case, I don't think anyone can argue my choice for number 1. 2 stellar tracks by the Beatles, both lyrically and thematically intertwined, both about childhood memories of Liverpool. Strawberry Fields Forever, the Salvation Army Children's Home where John Lennon used to play as a child. Penny Lane is the bus terminus or the roundabout where they often changed bus routes in order to visit one another. John Lennon wrote entirely Strawberry Fields Forever. He has said that this was his finest work with the Beatles. Penny Lane had a little bit of, mostly a Paul song, but had a little bit of help in the lyrics by John Lennon. Interesting, I could go on and on about Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, but I will just say one thing. The version that we hear of Strawberry Fields Forever is actually compiled by 2 different sessions, session number 7 and 26. John couldn't decide which one he preferred and said, put them both together, you can figure it out. And the task was up to George Martin, and I believe Jeff Emmerich, who was the engineer, to figure out how to splice them together. And as a matter of fact, I think they were different tempos, so one had to be slowed down and the other one had to be slightly sped up in order to be seamlessly put together. Strawberry Fields Forever took 45 studio hours to record. Blah, 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 I can go on forever. Oh, one last thing. The first of only 2 picture sleeves in the UK of a Beatles single. The other one was Let It Be, one of the, I think the last single by the Beatles. So there you have it, folks. The #1 single released by the Beatles, Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, or Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields Forever. Hope you enjoyed watching. Hope I didn't bore you too much. I guess that wraps it up for the top 10 singles released by the Beatles, +1. And that's it for today. And I guess I will see you on the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.